Stephen. Great to be back with you guys again today. Love day two. I love this event. I love seeing the chats blow up every day. I love the engagement that we get from our community. Stephen gave me a very kind intro. As he was talking, I could see him smirk a little bit. He actually knows me really well, so he knows half the words he said about me weren't technically true, but I'm really grateful for the introduction anyway. So let's get into it. Really excited for the topic we're going to cover today. See if I can sort of get my clicker working here. There we go. So today we're going to take the next about 40 minutes to talk about 8 practices that drive nonprofit innovation and impact. So I want to lead off with this amazing quote from Walt Disney. So Walt said, "Around here, however, we don't look backwards very long. We keep moving forwards, opening up new doors and doing new things because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths." I absolutely love Walt Disney. So one of the most innovative people in the last century rethought how we do family entertainment, rethought how we make movies, rethought even organizational culture in some way and family entertainment. Just unbelievable innovator. And I think it's safe to say that all of us kind of want to be a little bit more like Walt, right? We all want to be more innovative. We want that big transformation that makes a big impact in the world, but change is hard. So this is a picture of my family. Yes, I will take any excuse possible to show a picture of my family. It's my wife and daughter and Donald Duck, keeping with the Disney theme. The reason I show this picture isn't just because it's my family, but my daughter is 10 years old and she's infinitely curious. She's always asking why. She always wants to know the thing behind the thing. Very, very curious. And like my daughter, I'm curious too. And as I've spent the last couple of years in the nonprofit space, or 15 years, I've had this growing curiosity around innovation, particularly revolving around 2 core questions. So the first question I began to ask was this: how are the very best nonprofits continuing to drive increased innovation to tackle tough challenges? In other words, nonprofits that are able to evolve and innovate quickly, how are they sort of embodying that ethos of Walt Disney, right? How are they sort of figuring out where the world could be, like this vision of the world that doesn't yet exist, and driving into that new world? The second question is like it, which is, what are the key inhibitors of innovation in the nonprofit space, and how can these inhibitors be overcome? And otherwise, what are the speed bumps? Like if you look at nonprofits that sort of stick with the status quo and don't innovate, what are those sort of roadblocks that stand in their way? And so fortunately, I've been blessed to have front row seats to see thousands of nonprofit professionals navigate change and dismantle the status quo. In my job every day, I get to talk to people way smarter than me that have been able to evolve their nonprofits and rethink how we do the good work that we do in the world. So let's step back for a minute. Why are we having this conversation? Why does innovation matter? Why is it so important to me? Well, I think the best way to illustrate this is something called Martek's law. So I know there's a lot on this graph, but I want to take just a second to go through it because I think it's critically important. Martek's law was created by a guy named Scott Brinker. This slide comes to us from Scott's organization. If you look at the yellow line in this graph, this is basically how fast technology changes in our world. So technology sort of pivots up and changes at an exponential rate. So if you sort of grew up in the 90s like I did, you had this experience like in the late 90s of getting AOL or Prodigy in your house for the first time. The internet comes into our home, you hear the weird modem sound, right? And you get email for the first time. It's amazing. Well, shortly after the internet, we have sort of like some user groups and message boards, and then we have MySpace, like social media, and then we have the iPhone, and then social media blows up on the iPhone, right? And then with the iPhone, we have like Airbnb, we have Uber that happens, and now we have things like cryptocurrency and the blockchain, and then AI. Basically, all of these technologies stack on top of one another. So somebody comes up with a good idea, and then the next person comes along, disrupts that idea, stands on the shoulders of giants, and makes another huge leap forward. That's how technology works in the world we live in. The problem is organizations don't change at that pace, right? Not just nonprofits, for-profits as well. They change more sort of logarithmically, meaning they do basically the same thing. They just work on getting 1% better every day. So what happens is technology is changing really fast, organizations change slow, and then you have this widening gap between where the world is today and where the organization sits, which creates a problem, right? So the organization is now operating in a world that no longer exists. And so under Martek's law, basically what Brinker says is organizations have to occasionally sort of reset, or at the very least find very small pockets of innovation that like represent step changes to allow them to keep up with the world that they're living in. So incredibly important and a little bit sobering. So this tells us that if you're trying to do the same thing you've always done, you're living in a world that no longer exists. So it's really important to note here, innovation is way more than just technology, right? It's processes and tactics, it's your people and team, and it is your platforms and technology. If we go back and look at Walt Disney and say, what are the biggest innovations Disney ever had? They're not always technology innovations. In fact, like the biggest innovation is maybe his staff members, instead of thinking about them as employees, he taught them to act as cast members, right? And so if you've ever been at a Disney property, everybody walks around acting like they're part of the cast. That innovation had nothing to do with tech, but it was a huge step function in sort of culture and thinking about theme park experiences. So really important to keep in mind, we're not just talking about technology here. So does that really happen? Does Martek's law really apply? Meaning, is the world really increasing so fast that organizations become irrelevant? Well, I wanted to point out just a couple of examples here. I've put 4 for-profit logos here. I could have easily put 4 nonprofit logos, but I don't want to throw any nonprofits under the bus in this talk. So we're going to focus on the for-profit space. So on the left there, you have Kodak. So Kodak, many people don't know, they actually invented the digital camera really about 20 years before the digital camera became a thing. But they lived in this world where they made their money and really, really cared about print photography, right? Sending your pictures to Walgreens and going to pick them up and having a printed version. They couldn't quite imagine a world where everybody be looking at pictures on screens. And as a result, they sort of imploded, right? Toys R Us. Toys R Us was really slow to adopt e-commerce and couldn't figure it out. They couldn't imagine a world where kids wouldn't want to come into a Toys R Us store in a mall and touch and feel the toys they're going to buy, and as a result, imploded. BlackBerry famously said that who would ever want to have a phone where you couldn't touch and feel the buttons on a phone? They couldn't imagine a world where an iPhone existed that was just one big screen, right? And Blockbuster famously has this opportunity to buy Netflix at a value that's infinitely cheaper than they are today, and passed on the chance to buy Netflix. The reason they did is they had these in-person stores and they couldn't imagine a world where people would be streaming movies into their home. All of these companies no longer exist or are a shell of what they used to be because they succumbed to the consequences of Martek's law. And so with that in mind, like if that law is true and we live in that world, we have to really think about where we focus our innovation energy. So as nonprofits, how do we figure out what innovation is most relevant to us? And then how do we develop a culture where we can adapt and change quickly over time? So a way to think about this is that we need a new model to help rethink innovation. One of my favorite quotes on this is from Adam Grant, a well-known author and speaker. He said, intelligence is traditionally viewed as the ability to think and learn. Yet in a turbulent world, like the world we live in today, a turbulent world, there's another set of cognitive skills that might matter even more. It's the ability to rethink and unlearn. In other words, how do we break free of the status quo? And how do we find new ways and new patterns of doing things to help us evolve faster? So with that in mind, I'm just launching a new book. It's called The Responsive Nonprofit, 8 Practices That Drive Innovation and Impact in Your Nonprofit. If you're looking for a silver bullet for innovation, this is not the book for you. In fact, all 8 practices in this book are tried and true best practices, some borrowed from the for-profit space and others borrowed from these amazing nonprofit trailblazers that have done this really well over time. Also, I interviewed people way smarter than me for this book. So this book isn't all just my ideas. We went out and talked to some of the best and brightest in the space to be able to look at this idea of innovation from different angles. So let's jump into it. What are the 8 practices that drive innovation? Okay, so first of all, I don't have time to cover all 8 of these in the talk today. We're going to deep dive into 2 areas, but I did want to provide a really brief overview into each of the areas that are the catalyst for innovation in your nonprofit. It all starts with this idea first of dismantling team silos there in the top right. To be an effective, innovative nonprofit, you have to break down silos between your marketing team, your fundraising team, your programs team, ops and finance, volunteering, and IT. Those teams cannot operate in silos. And so dismantling team silos is about having teams communicate and collaborate well. It's about having shared goals and metrics across all the teams so everyone is looking at the same number, moving in the same direction. The second is metrics and goals. And so some nonprofits have been historically bad at sort of measuring what matters, right? Or like having a number that everybody's focused on. So everybody at the organization knows their number and the metric that matters, and they're chasing after it together. So metrics and goals, that chapter talks about how do we set quarterly goals as an organization that we can go after? How do we ensure that everybody on the team knows their number and is moving in the same direction? The next is the agile methodology, which is just a way of working in 2-week sprints to be able to test a hypothesis, iterate quickly, and innovate fast. Human-centered design, which is one of the areas where we'll deep dive, is about developing empathy, and we'll talk about that later. Managing change, you can't be effective as a nonprofit if you can't move your staff and your processes from A to B without losing people along the way, right? So managing change is critical in nonprofit culture. The next is actually around culture specifically. How do I build a team culture of innovation that keeps people from burning out and attracts and retains the greatest talent available? Community and storytelling is about this recognition that if I'm limited by my current staff and budget, it's always going to be hard. But the reality is I have this huge movement of people that care deeply about my cause. How do I activate that community through storytelling to help drive my mission forward? And then finally, the other topic where we'll deep dive today is generosity operations. It's a new kind of team at nonprofits that sits outside of all the other teams that helps drive generosity and alignment across the organization. If you're in the keynote yesterday, Eric Tamales talked about this a little bit. We're going to deep dive into it a little bit more through the rest of the talk. So again, here's the areas where we're going to dive in: generosity operations and human-centered design. I think both of these are critically important, and they'll be a great spot to hang out in the remaining time we have. So let's get into it. Human-centered design. What is human-centered design? That word might be familiar to some of you guys on the call. It's a concept that was created, I don't know, 50 years ago, really made famous by the folks at Stanford and Stanford's design school, but now is kind of ubiquitous, especially across the tech space. But it's an incredibly helpful concept. So to illustrate this concept, I want to start with this big river, right? So there's a story that's sort of been an analogy forever and was sort of reused again and made famous again by Dan Heath in his recent book, Upstream. But I think it's really helpful in understanding human-centered design. So the story goes, there's 2 guys standing beside this river, okay, having a great time, not thinking about much of anything. And all of a sudden they see a kid floating down the river, kid struggling to keep his head above water and clearly in trouble. So one of the guys jumps into the river, pulls the kid out, gets him to the shore. Now hands on his knees, breathing hard, saying like, thank goodness we got that kid out of the water. A minute later, another kid in the water, drowning, like keeping his head above water. The guy's buddy jumps in the river, swims out, pulls the kid out. And they're both looking at each other now like, that was crazy. 2 kids almost drowning in the river. 2 minutes later, another kid. First guy jumps in and saves the kid. And this goes on, kid after kid after kid for the next 10 minutes. They're jumping in and pulling kids out of the water. Okay. Eventually, one of the 2 guys kind of looks at his friend, looks back, and starts sprinting upstream in the river. And his buddy yells at him. He says, "Where the heck are you going? I need somebody to help me pull all these kids out of the water." And the guy running upstream says, "You know what? I need to go find the guy who's throwing these kids in the water," right? And so the idea here is that we have to move upstream of problems. We can't just continue to pull kids out of the water. We have to move upstream and figure out who's throwing the kids in the water and get to the root cause of problems. So then the question becomes, how do we as organizations move upstream and figure out the root cause? And in human-centered design, it all starts with this idea of empathy gathering. And so in human-centered design, we can't really solve problems until we develop true empathy and understanding for the people we're serving. And so the people we're serving may be on the program side of your organization. They're the people that you're helping every day, but they're also your donors. They're any of the constituents that you serve. You have to be able to drive empathy, get in their shoes, and understand their pain and their needs. So what is the process of human-centered design, or HCD? Well, again, it starts with this first stage, which is empathize. So when you're sort of zeroing in on a problem, so let's say we don't understand what our donors want or why they give, right? Really common problem. We don't understand why our donors don't stick around while they're not retaining. We need to understand what our donors are going through. It can't just be leadership saying, like, this is why our donors aren't giving, we're going to do this. You have to start with actually talking to your donors and understanding their needs. So this means bottoms up research. It means surveys. It means probing questions to your donors. And it means an approach that has open and honest curiosity. And so empathy, so much of the time, is just like hanging out with your donors, asking why, figuring out what makes them tick, why they gave to your organization originally, like what they understand about your organization, really taking the time to get in their shoes. So that's empathize. The next step in HCD is define. So now you have a ton of notes. You've surveyed a lot of people. You've done a lot of research. You've asked a lot of questions. Now you have to define the problem behind the problem, right? So the problem is, donors aren't retaining, they're not giving again, but why? Like, what is the why behind that problem? And when you start defining the problem, it's important to avoid presuppositions and foregone conclusions. So you might have been telling stories around your organization for the last 5 years about this is why donors don't stick around. You have to throw all that out the window and look at defining the problem in a new way. Ideate just means, hey, now we're going to come up with ideas to fix the problem. This is one of those traditional like brainstorming sessions where no idea is a bad idea. You want to throw everything at the wall, no ideas off limits, and really think outside the box to think about how you get to the root cause, how you go upstream and break through fixed mindsets. And then finally, prototype. This one is critical. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But it's the idea that once you think you have the right idea, you still might be wrong. And so prototypes basically say, what is the minimum amount of work that we can do as an organization to prove if this is the right or wrong idea, right? Like, how can we test something in the next month, in the next 2 weeks, in the next day that will tell us if we're in the right area here to solve this problem? That's a prototype. So I just want to dive deeper on a couple of those items and give like some practical examples of how this works itself out. So the first one is on empathy. If you're familiar with the company Toyota, you know that in the late 70s, early 80s, Toyota completely revolutionized the automobile industry. So American cars were, the quality was poor and they were getting worse and worse every year. There's these horror stories of people finding like bolts that were just sitting in the doors of their cars, of their Chevys, right? Toyota said that world doesn't have to exist. They came up with this more Kanban style methodology where they were always zeroing in on the best quality, trying to get as close to perfect as they could. And behind all that was this concept of asking why 5 times. So at Toyota, if something was going wrong, you said, why is that going wrong? You get an answer back. And then you say, but why? And you get an answer back. And but why? You get an answer back. It's exactly like me when I'm in the car with my 10-year-old daughter. She asks a question, I give her an answer, she says, why? I give her an answer. She says why. So this is the Toyota methodology. Ask why 5 times. It's incredibly important as you're talking to your donors or other constituents you serve, because you really want to take time to understand, like, why do you feel that way? Why do you understand the world the way you understand it? So always when you're talking with constituents, ask why 5 times. The second one is this idea of minimum viable products, or MVPs. You hear this a lot in the tech space. This is really our prototype concept and the way we test a hypothesis. I love the word hypothesis. Our friends at Next After use this all the time. We never come into a situation where we say we know exactly what the right answer is. We say we have a hypothesis around what the right answer might be, but we need to test it to figure out if it works. There's this great book, The Lean Startup, that was written for tech startups, but honestly, every nonprofit leader that I know that's read it, it's been transformative in how they think about testing new ideas and building a minimum viable product. So for you, that might be, hey, we have a new way that we think email might work. Like, we think we could do super short form email from a person instead of long form email from the organization. Well, how can I test that? I don't have to change my whole email program. Maybe I just peel off 400 donors and I try it one time and I look at the click-through rate and response rate. What's the smallest way that I can test this hypothesis to see if it works? That's an MVP. Highly recommend that book if you haven't read it. Really helpful in understanding this concept. The next one is we want to iterate with end users in 2-week sprints. This kind of goes to the agile practice in our book, but it's basically the idea that when we have an idea and we get a minimum viable product to test, we just don't want to sort of set it and forget it. Every 2 weeks, we want to do what's in Agile called sprint planning, but basically it's the idea that we have a hypothesis to test, we start testing it, we see some results, and then we want to involve our end users in the conversation, like, hey, how did you experience that? Like, how did that work for you? Like, did you like that? What did you not like? What was confusing? And doing that in 2-week sprints helps us test, validate, refine, iterate, and then quickly zero in on what the right solution is. So 2-week sprints to test a new idea, and then meet with users to get feedback at the end of each 2 weeks. Failing fast. This one's another one that gets used in tech a lot, but I absolutely love it. At some of the nonprofits I've been a part of, failure is punished. And so everybody's afraid to fail. So everybody just does their best to stay in the status quo, right? There's nothing worse for an organization than an organization that punishes failure. That's a failure forward. That's a failure in experimenting and trying something new. And so instead at organizations, we should say it's okay to fail, but what we want to do is fail fast, right? We don't want to start an idea, realize it's not working, and then spend the next year dragging that idea out before we cut it. We want to figure out what works. If it doesn't work, we want to stop doing it, pivot, and move to something else. This is really hard in nonprofits because sometimes you have like annual planning and annual budget cycles. It's like, man, we committed to do that in February. We got to stick with it for the next 12 months. It's important that your leadership board and everybody at your organization's aligned to say, like, yeah, we're going to try something. If it doesn't work, we're going to stop, pivot, and reorient. We're going to fail fast, and we're going to learn from our failures along the way. There's this amazing case study of water.org. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this case study because actually in a session later today that I invite you to attend, Josh Gunkel, who worked at water.org, is going to be talking with Jason Van Loo specifically about human-centered design and how some of these sort of practices come to life. But the basic story is water.org realized that just sort of digging wells wasn't going to fully solve the water crisis globally. They knew that they needed sort of big capital investments in infrastructure and systems, and they created something called water equity. Well, as you guys might imagine, who are fundraisers, sending out a fundraising appeal that says invest in big systems and infrastructure for big capital investments. That's like the worst fundraising message ever. So they thought, shoot, how are we going to raise money out of from this? And so they actually contracted with this organization called IDEO that focuses on human-centered design. And they surveyed their donors and asked their donors, what matters to you? How do you understand our cause? How do you want to engage? and launched several initiatives, including something called the Float app that allows smaller donors to be able to engage in a meaningful way that closes the loop on their impact, even with these bigger sort of capital infrastructure projects. But it started with human-centered design of interviewing donors, understanding their needs, and then pushing forward from there. But again, go to Josh's section, you'll get more information about water.org. So that's all well and good, sounds fun. Like practically though, what can I do as a fundraiser today? So I wanted to just throw out a couple of really practical ideas around human-centered design that I thought might be helpful. The first is 100 donor conversations. I know this sounds crazy, but if you're a fundraiser or if you're in marketing on a fundraising or comm on a fundraising team or like fundraising operations, everybody on your team should talk with at least 100 donors. Calling them up, not asking them for money, not pushing an agenda, but just asking questions like, why did you give? Like, how did you find out about our cause? What do you understand about our cause? Like, what do you care about most? What was your personal connection? In interviewing donors, I guarantee you that if you could have most of your team have 100 conversations with donors just like that, it will transform the way you do fundraising because you're going to have massive clarity on what your donors care about, how they want to interact with your cause, what drives them to give, what messages resonate. And so I would say, man, if everybody in your team can figure out how to have 100 donor conversations, I know it sounds crazy, but totally doable. Just pick up the phone, be open and authentic, and ask questions. Incredibly powerful. The next is post-donation surveys. And so you don't necessarily want to interrupt somebody when they're giving an online gift, right? You want them to get to the completion of that gift. But after they give, there's no reason you can't ask them a couple of questions about what drove them to give, right? And so on this form here, we have like, how did you hear about our cause? And I can't read it all, but what makes you most passionate about donating to us? And so asking donors questions after donation can give you incredible insights around why people give, what drives them, what drives their passion, and really lean into empathy. I love that these aren't drop downs, by the way. I think we like to default to drop downs because it's like, well, we have 5 choices. I, the qualitative open text field is amazing. I know it takes more time to sort of sort through that data, but I think the insights are so much better that you get from just an open text field on these forms. Okay, that's human-centered design. Again, there's going to be another session on that today if you want to dive deeper, but it's an incredibly powerful concept in driving innovation. I want to finish up here with my last couple of minutes talking about generosity operations and a generosity ops team. Again, there's going to be another session today on generosity operations that really goes deep here. And Eric Tamales covered some of this yesterday in his maturity model session as well. So you can go back and watch that. But this is an area where if you're not doing this today, really encourage you to lean in. It can be a game changer. So there's 2 problems that generosity operation solves. Again, we covered some of this material yesterday, but I think it's important enough where I really want to double down. So the first problem that this team solves, and we'll get into what the team looks like in a minute, but the first problem we want to solve is unresponsive one-to-many donor experiences, right? So it's this idea that as organizations, when we do fundraising, we have an amazing relationship with our top 100 donors. We know everything about them. We know their kids' names. We know their dogs' names. And then everybody else is just getting an email appeal or a piece of direct mail. They're just names in a database. And we're using sort of spray and pray marketing to create really impersonal experiences for those donors. The second problem is connected. We talked about dismantling team silos already, but this is what it functionally looks like. Like fundraising that team, honestly, and I fundraise for a couple of boards I'm on. I'm with you guys, but sometimes it's seen as a necessary evil for the organization, right? It's like the salespeople that get the money so we can do the real work of the cause. A lot of times, like in an organization my wife used to work for, the fundraising team sat on the other side of the parking lot from the program team. They didn't talk to one another at all. You have sort of this silo that gets built up. Same with fundraising and marketing. Marketing is telling stories, but not necessarily aligned to fundraising strategy. Program is doing their own thing. They're getting these great stories about the work they're doing, but those stories never really make it back to marketing or fundraising. And then finance and IT is just overloaded, bogged down with a backlog and lack of visibility into what everybody else is doing. So many nonprofit teams that I work with begin to look like this over time, especially as they scale. So we need to move toward a new model, which is a more responsive donor experience where you have dynamic campaigns based on the behavior of each donor, where every donor, instead of getting like spray and pray marketing or direct mail or email, they're all getting a sequence of communication on multiple channels that's most relevant to them, right? That's where we want to move. Personalized donor journeys. When organizations do this, we see retention goes up, average gift goes up, engagement goes up, like so much goodness. We also want a more responsive team experience where all of your teams are working together with shared insights. They're aligned to the same KPIs. They're collaborating, all working together to drive generosity growth. In other words, we want to treat every donor like a major donor, and we want your team to be focused on meaningful work, not menial work. One of our customers the other day used this quote. I absolutely love it, so I'm reusing it here, but I think that's just a perfect example of what we want here, where we don't want manual work, data entry, things being thrown back and forth between teams. We want you to automate your menial work and focus on meaningful work. So how does Generosity Ops solve these challenges? Well, this is what it looks like functionally. So you can see there in the middle of the screen, we have Generosity Ops, right? So this is a team that sits outside all of your other teams, right? So they're not really part of fundraising, marketing, program, or finance. They actually work across all of your teams to drive a coherent strategy, to share insights across the team, provide common reporting, KPI alignment, to sort of expose areas where you can grow generosity and honestly drive innovation, like find little pockets of innovation across the company or the nonprofit and scale it, right? At large nonprofits, I recommend setting aside a small team for this, usually what we call an innovation champion, somebody that understands the organization, your mission, a little bit about fundraising, and then pair them with like a data hacker, like a data wonk that knows how to go get the stuff out of all the spreadsheets and pull everything together. If you're at a smaller organization, I totally get it. The idea of hiring two new people for a new team can be really, really hard. Then in that case, I would say form a committee across your department. So somebody from fundraising, program, ops, they're meeting together at least one monthly, maybe even weekly to start out with, and they're just sort of looking under the hood in each other's departments, like where's the data today? How do you guys look at what does success look like for you? How can we line up our success together going in one direction? So the focus areas of this team are metrics and data visibility. We want data and key metrics to be available and easy to find across the entire organization. So if we say donor retention is the number one focus of our nonprofit this year, everybody at the organization should be able to see that number whenever they want, and they should know how they impact that number. And so this team can help that data visibility begin to dismantle team silos across the organization. And then they can focus on automating the menial. So where are we doing a ton of manual data entry, way too much cleanup? Where are things getting lost and buried in spreadsheets? How do we automate menial tasks so we can focus on meaningful work? And then finally, how are we sharing insights and driving innovation across the organization? So I put these up as just practical questions that you should hear from this team. So when you talk to your generosity ops team, they should be saying things like, hey, did you know that 50% of our volunteers donate within 30 days of volunteering? Oh my gosh, I had no idea. Our volunteer team doesn't talk to our fundraising team. That's news to me. That's awesome, right? Did you know that online givers convert to second gift or online givers convert to a second gift 40% more often, meaning our online givers retain way better than our offline givers? Or you ask for our Save One Life campaign, or did you know that our Save One Life campaign converts to major donors better than any other campaign? Right? So it's like we start understanding what messages resonate most and drive major giving. If we automate moves management, we can save 20 hours per week and eliminate missed opportunities. So how we're using automation to save time. The program team has an opportunity to capture video stories and marketing every Friday. I bet you guys didn't know that. It's awesome. We've seen some of their videos already. What kind of videos should we capture that were most helpful for the marketing team? Right? All very sort of tactical, practical examples of what you should now be hearing from your new generosity ops team to begin to break down silos and expose insights across the organization. So tools of the trade, just to finish out here, this new generosity ops team has a couple of tools in their holster that should be really, really valuable in driving results. So the first one is business intelligence. Many of you who are on this today that are larger nonprofits, you already know what business intelligence is. You can think about tools like Tableau or Power BI. These are basically new data tools that can look at your data and easily drive insights. So anybody on your team can rummage around in data and be able to pull out the insights they need to do their job. So Virtuous Art Company has a brand new BI tool embedded. There's some other great providers out there as well, but it's a great way to sort of pull in all your data in one space and be able to drive insights, especially across multiple data sets. That's BI. The other tool to trade here is marketing and process automation software. And so if we want to automate the menial, so we can focus on the meaningful, we need software that can begin to automate all of that little small stuff that we end up doing every day. The same click that you make 400 times a day because it can't be automated. This generosity ops team begin to find places across the organization where we can use software to automate menial tasks to give you hours back in your day. And then finally, team collaboration tools. Most of you guys today are probably using this, but this team can sort of be the shepherd of tools like Trello. And so you have visibility across all the initiatives across all departments. So you can see how all the puzzle pieces fit together, how the timelines fit together. They can help facilitate Slack conversations where you have Slack channels where you know your fundraising and marketing team are going to be sharing insights and updates weekly, right? Or your program team. And then tools like Notion. If you guys don't use Notion today, it's worth checking out. It's an organizational repository where learnings can be shared across the organization. And so everybody knows where to go to get the data. This team can own those tools and really help make sure that they're deployed effectively across the organization. Okay, I have been talking fast for 37 minutes straight. Hopefully there's some helpful stuff in there that you can take back and use at your organization. So again, jump into the generosity ops session on the tech stage to dive deeper into that. Outside of that, if there are topics here that sounded interesting to you, you really want to go deep on, really encourage you to pick up the book. I believe it's available for pre-sale now on Amazon, and it should be shipping here in the next week or two. I think this book will be a helpful resource for you as you begin to drive innovation at your nonprofit and find areas where you can sort of beat MarTech's law and grow quickly. Again, thank you guys so much for the time. Thanks for joining the Responsive Nonprofit Summit. It is a joy to get to hang out with you guys virtually over these 3 days. I hope you enjoy the rest of the time. Thank you so much.